So if we look at the beginning of Landsberg's essay, it starts with, I think, a very important question to keep in mind as we're interpreting Landsberg and trying to figure out what he's getting at. And that opening question is, what is the meaning of death to the human being as a person? As a person. And as we'll see, that notion of being a person, which is an interesting distinction that Landsberg makes, which philosophers in one way or another regularly make between being a person and being a mere human being, you might say, is an important thing to keep in mind. The whole notion of personhood, and we'll get into the details, hopefully, in a clear way about what he means by the person. But you might remember that Glenn Gray asked really the very same question, about the meaning and significance of death to human life, in the essay we read last week, The Idea of Death and Existentialism. So I think Landsberg is asking a similar question. He's asking the same question. What is the meaning of death to us? How do we regard death? What is the significance of death for how we think about ourselves and our lives? As we'll see, he has a very different answer to that question than the existentialist did. Heidegger said that human existence was a being towards death. One of the specific things that Landsberg wants to do with this essay, amongst other things, I would suppose, but one of the very important things, I think, for him, is to try to refute Heidegger, or at least to try to overcome or provide an alternative to the Heideggerian notion that human existence is essentially a being towards death. You might say that ultimately one of the things that Landsberg wants to show, if he can, is that human existence is a being beyond death, that we are not oriented towards death as the final limit of our existence, but rather that we are oriented towards something that goes beyond death. So something to keep in mind. But if we look at part one, let's just say section one of the essay is called The State of the Question, and he raises some interesting issues here. Maybe he won't be following up these questions in any kind of methodical way, but he raises some interesting issues about death and our knowledge of death. He quotes Voltaire, great 18th century French thinker, philosopher Voltaire, on the first page of the essay. The human race is the only one that knows it must die, and it knows this only through its experience. Well, for Landsberg, that raises certain questions, certain puzzles. To say that we know that we're going to die, and to say that that is a unique characteristic of the human species as opposed to other animal creatures is probably not very surprising. There are many ways in which human beings differ from the rest of the animal kingdom. And our knowledge of our own mortality, or our knowledge that we will, each one of us, our knowledge that we will die, seems to be one of those things. But it's the must die, which is interesting there. That is not, human beings not only know that they'll probably die, that death is a possibility for them, they know that they will die, that death is necessary for them, that there's no getting around death, that to be human means to have to face death. Now, what makes that paradoxical is the next part of it, that we know this only through our experience. Well, as Landsberg points out, our knowledge of death, if it comes from our experience of the world, of other human beings and their fates, then our knowledge of death or our knowledge that human beings all die would be an inductive generalization. That is, we've seen that all the human beings up to now who've lived have also died, except for the few of us who are here populating this planet right now. Famously in logic or in philosophy, we say that any generalization on the basis of individual instances can only be one of probability, could never be of necessity. Right? It's just like the old thing. If every apple you see is red, then you can generalize and say all apples are red, but the next apple you see may not be red. every human being who's lived to this point has died, but the next human being might not. I guess that's almost a silly thing to say, but it would seem that it would be possible, right? So that death would then be one of overwhelming probability. That is, the fact that I will die seems to be overwhelmingly probable, but it wouldn't bring with it necessity. So that, of course, raises the issue of like how well, we do think it's necessary that we die, that we cannot avoid it, that's inevitable. Well, where does that knowledge come from? What in our experience? Do we have any experience of the necessity of death, not just the overwhelming probability of death? At the end of page 194, which is the second page of the essay, Landsberg asked this question: is there a specific experience of death through which one might learn that death was natural to man in the wholeness of his personal life? And I think that he's sort of asking, well, as he says in the next line on top page 195, and this experience, which already allows us to establish the fact of considerable probability, does it not also confront us with the fact of necessity? That is, he's looking for an experience in which it would be revealed to us not only that we probably will die, or that we'll likely die, even and overwhelmingly likely that we'll die, but something that presents us with the necessity of death. Or death is natural to man. Death is part of our nature. So that sets him off on looking for certain experiences, and I guess that accounts for the title, The Experience of Death. Is there anything in our experience that is the experience of death? You know, that lets us know what death is, not just that death happens, but perhaps what death is. And the first place he looks is in the second part, is some ideas from a philosopher of his time named Max Scheler, or Scheler, I don't know how to pronounce the German. Let's just say Max Scheler, and he's looking for what is the experience of death? Through what do we experience death itself? And Scheler has some very interesting ideas about that. That is that we experience death as we approach death in old age, so that in the experience of growing old, we experience death. In section 2 on page 195, he says, along these lines that Scheler has tried to restate the theory of biological experience and discover the true nature of the human experience of death. But we cannot be satisfied with his reply to our question. What he has described in his profound and deeply illuminating manner is the experience of growing old. According to him, the idea of death occurs only as a limiting point, which one may foresee by observing the development of the process of growing old. The structure of our life changes noticeably at every moment. The pressure of the past grows heavier, and the possibilities of the future more narrow. Man feels himself less and less free, less and less capable of transforming the meaning of his life by shaping his future. As he grows old, he loses not only the sense of freedom, but to a certain degree, freedom itself. So interesting answer. That is, what is the human experience of death? Well, we experience as we get older, that experience of more and more of our life being in the past and less of it being in the future, and the accompanying feeling of loss of freedom, loss of possibility, that sense in which our future is shrinking and the possibilities of what we can do with our lives are narrowing, which is a very interesting, I think it's something undoubtedly true about that, of getting older. As we approach old age, we really get the feeling of death becoming closer, and the amount of time we have left shrinking, and the amount of time we have lived getting larger, and that sense of the past, getting personal past, biographical past. experience is like, what things seem like, how they appear. So doing the phenomenology of old age would be how does experience change as we get older? How does our outlook change? How does the world appear different to us? How do we appear different to ourselves as we age, as we grow old? That's all really interesting, Landsberg says, but it's not the experience of death, or it's not the phenomenology of death, because of course not everyone does get old. Not everyone has that experience of the narrowing of horizons as they grow old. Death can come at any time. As he says on page 196, it is evident to me not only that I must die once, that is to say, when I have reached the limiting point of natural death, but also that I am face to face at every moment of my life, now and always, with the immediate possibility of death. Death is very close to me. Human uncertainty with regard to death is not merely a result of a lacuna in biology, but also of my ignorance of my destiny. And even this ignorance is an act in which there is a presence as well as an absence of death. Mors certa, ora incerta, which I believe in Latin means death is certain, but the hour of death is uncertain. The dialectic of death is secret. It is an absent presence. That is, death is not here, obviously, since I exist, but it's kind of like always here as a possibility. So if human beings face death in a way at every moment of their lives as a possibility, as the absent presence, the thing that is present to us because it's absent, the thing that is always with us just because it's an unrealized possibility, then Sheeler's phenomenology of aging as being the phenomenology of death couldn't quite be correct, just because it doesn't cover all death, and it doesn't account for that notion of death not being the limiting point of my horizon sometime in the future as my possibilities slowly narrow, but death as a constant companion, you might say, of human existence, just because it's the thing that's possible, which is really a very, very existentialist concern, that notion of death being something that's always there. So he is looking for something beyond that is, rejects the idea that the experience of death, the human experience of death, is the experience of aging. It's got to be something else, so he'll be looking in other places.